Hello, I'm Tony Guida. Welcome to my New York. What a treat I have for you today. And we're going to start it with an embarrassing moment, very embarrassing moment from my early career. Now, the blame for that photograph falls squarely on the woman in the foreground. Her name is Carol Jenkins, a beloved former colleague, but she threatened to blackmail me with that picture, and sadly, there was plenty to blackmail me about. That is me in the plaid pants. So I said, Carol, come on the program instead. Let's talk about it. I'm delighted she agreed. You'll meet her next. I feel very lucky today, and I think you will agree. We have a wonderful guest. Her name is Carol Jenkins. It is delightful to see you.
It's so good to see you. Not wearing plaid pants still. You really dressed yourself up.
Yeah. Who was my tailor in those days? Red Skelton?
But the one thing that I noticed about that picture is that I appear to be working, at least, and you're just spreading the charm, as always, which was right. Tony's...
You're so glib.
Tony's world contribution.
Let's talk about that photo more in detail and what it represents. It's 1970 at Channel 9.
Right.
Your first job in television.
Right. And you're, second, right?
Third. I have my first in New York.
Right.
I'm from New York, but my first, I had worked two other places before. My first in New York, and Lem Tucker, who was the boss, wonderful guy, picked you out of what, the secretarial pool?
Well, I was a secretary at CBS. Now, I had graduated from college and, gotten my master's and all of that, and annoyed my parents to no end by saying, no, I didn't want to do that, So I got a job in the secretarial pool at CBS, and then...
which is where Lem was a correspondent.
Right, and also at NBC. My goal in life was always to work for NBC. That was my total ambition. And I went to apply for a job there, and they said, well, we'd like you to have a little more experience than zero. So one of our correspondents...
How rude of them.
I know. And I said, I just love you. I want to work here. And so they said, one of our correspondents is starting up a new news show on Channel 9, and Lem Tucker, go over there, and maybe you can work in the office there or whatever and get some experience. And so just by luck, now you were hired as a reporter, right? And I was hired as a researcher. But whoever the reporter was supposed to be for that show never showed up.
Really?
And I was put into that position. It was crazy. And, Lem was such a staunch, really strict guy, serious news.
He was a tough boss.
He started teaching me how to write. And the first assignment I got, not that it ever ran on the air, was about median barriers. Now, do you know how exciting that is, And I went through 40...
What we now call the Jersey walls or whatever.
Yes, exactly. I went through 40 versions of that before he said, okay. So it was just really being given the opportunity, and I'm so grateful for that.
Well, you ran with it and ran well with it. But I don't think people remember, and we should remind them, in 1970 there were very few women in the business, television news business.
Right.
And there were virtually none who looked like you.
Exactly. And in fact, the way that many of us got into the news business during then was by, court order, edicts that came down. We were described, women and people of color were described as window dressing on the set. And so a lot of the people who started in the news, like John Johnson was an artist and an art teacher, and Melba Tolliver was a nurse. And I had gotten those degrees that my parents had paid for in speech pathology. So I think that, making that transition into, news was when that window was just beginning to open. But you have to remember, do you remember that 1970? Do you know how long it took before a woman anchored the network news? Was almost 40 years after that. And only now do we have Lester Holt, the first man of color, person of color, anchoring a network news
and
show.
sort of by accident.
Exactly.
We both worked with Lester, and he's a wonderful guy, and I'm so happy for him. But he wasn't chosen for that. I mean, the man who had the job blew it.
I know. He was given, as I was, an opportunity.
Yeah.
And he's doing quite well. But the news business, and we were talking a little bit about this, has changed drastically in terms of the technology, but it really hasn't changed that much in terms of the opportunity of opening it up, for...
Well, there still aren't an overflow of women reporters. I mean, I suppose, it's certainly a lot better representation today of the sex and color, people of color, Hispanic and African Americans.
Right, but my argument was that it was probably easier to run or become president of the United States than it was to become a questioner in the presidential debates or to sit in the anchor chair. It's such...
Because the assignments you were given were marginal at best.
Such an intransigent business, It's so... the prestige is incredible, the power, phenomenal, as you know it, from... waning perhaps, because people have access to their own information. But as a former reporter and current writer, where I like to express my opinion, in our day we weren't allowed to give our opinion about anything. But it's still shocking to me that it's still so difficult to make progress in this particular area.
Well, you went on to Channel 4 and wrote a wonderful career there. And in talking about assignments, I'm sure you had your share of bold assignments, but
yes.
You were also for Channel 4 in South Africa for Nelson Mandela,
right, which
being
was
released from prison.
Which was the highlight of my reporting career. I knew then, being in South Africa for that there would never be another story that matched it. And there never was. It was just incredible. I was standing with a producer and a cameraman the morning after Nelson Mandela was released from prison, going back to his tiny little house in Soweto. And here he comes walking out of his house, looking at the school children, dancing in front of him in their colorful uniforms going to school, really not knowing who he was and the impact that he had on their future lives. But incredible.
What a remarkable few days, week that must have been.
It was just, and that was when I began to understand the technology and the difference in that, because we were doing live remotes from South Africa. But I'd forgotten what the story was. It was some breakup of somebody, marital breakup that moved the Nelson Mandela story down the agenda. First we were the lead. This wonderful man who had spent 27 years in prison and open opportunities for millions of Africans, and then we were like the third story. And then by the end of that week, we were near the bottom of the show. Oh yeah, here's Carol from South Africa. Meanwhile, let's do the local breaking news.
You had a couple of interesting, besides this fabulous assignment at Channel 4, you had a couple of interesting assignments. One was in, as I think you sent us a picture, in a locker room with a guy who could be a tough person to interview.
Well,
Reggie Jackson, in case people don't know who that is.
Yeah, right, former Yankee baseball player. And that was the day the court order came down that women would be allowed in the locker room to do the interviews.
Uh-huh.
You see, that was another way that they kept women from really breaking news. I guess we really needed to break how baseball players felt about the game. And so I just happened to be on assignment that night and was there. He was not happy to see me, nor were her.
Reggie, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but he wasn't happy to see me once either.
Right.
He was a tough character. He didn't like media, I don't think, too much, unless he could, unless it was his stage.
Yeah, I think
he was controlling.
We were in the middle of a newspaper strike then, so the paper that they published, was on the front page of that newspaper with a headline that said "Nothing but the bare facts, man." And I think they cut him, a little bit so it looked like he was wearing zero. So that was a scandal of that particular day.
Let's talk about the beginnings. You talked about getting various degrees, but you didn't start out to be in this business. This was not your goal. This wasn't your dream.
No, because it seemed so incredibly remote and impossible. I come from rural Alabama. My grandparents were farmers. I was born in the 1940s, so if you can imagine rural Alabama in the 1940s, my mother was one of 15 children. And while my grandparents were excellent farmers and did very well, in those days it was, and I spent the first 3 years of my life there. There was not such a thing as indoor plumbing. And I had not such a thing as shoes so that was the beginning of my life. Also, the Black Panther Party started this is Lowndes County, Alabama, which, and years later, the march from Selma to Montgomery, the marchers would stay on our farm, spent the night, one night on our farm. But no, that was my beginning. And I've always said, it's a miracle, the distance that families can travel in the space of a generation or two or three. So that was my generation. We moved to New York. My parents had a business in New York. I went to college, and the next generation, my daughter went to Yale and Harvard. So Lowndes County, Alabama, that kind of hardscrabble existence
from the dirt, the red clay to the ivy.
To the ivy.
The ivy of the Ivy League.
Now, it took extraordinary persistence on the part of my stepfather, who managed all of that. He was just incredibly driven. And of course, we resented him for it. But ultimately, we turned around and said, hey, wait a minute. We traveled quite a distance based purely on his work ethic. He had been a printer in Birmingham, Alabama, and came to New York and opened a printing school and fought like the devil for 45 years to make a go of that business, and succeeded. I guess if you're in business for 45 years, you've succeeded.
Yeah. I've heard you talk about an instrumental person in your early years, Aunt Minnie?
Aunt Minnie, right, who was my mother's sister, one of the 15, one of the older of the 15, and so there were 15 of those children. I must say, too, the feminist family for rural Alabama. There were 9 girls, 6 boys. The 9 girls got to go to college, and the boys were expected to stay on the farm.
How unusual.
So all 9 girls were college educated.
Well, maybe not in a rural-oriented,
Right. Well, we needed the manpower in the purest sense to keep the farm going. But Aunt Minnie was the one who took care of, helped my grandparents take care of those 15 children, helped raise my mother. And then I have 40 first cousins, and she helped all of us with our education. She supplemented what our parents couldn't. If we couldn't quite make the tuition, she helped. If we didn't have clothes, she would sit at her sewing machine. I remember I went off to my freshman year in college at BU with 40 skirts that she had zipped up on her sewing machine. Never mind that they were completely out of fashion, and I wore my roommate's clothes. But I went with luggage full of something to wear.
You had a support system.
And books.
Aunt Minnie, you've told me, was married to A.G. Gaston, your uncle, about whom you and your daughter, Elizabeth, wrote a book later. Carol is she's done so many things, from television. She's a writer, she's a producer, she's got her own company.
I've been around for a long time, right?
Yeah, wow. Tell us about this. You wrote a book called
Black Titan.
Black Titan.
Yeah, A.G. Gaston and the Making of a Black American Millionaire. And he was born in Demopolis, Alabama, grandparents slaves, a mother a cook for one of the big families, department store owners in Birmingham, Alabama. And he went from that beginning, from the slave cabin, to being one of the first multimillionaires in the country, in Alabama.
Talk about an
arc. He fought in France during the war. That was World War I, too. Came back to this country and expected opportunity and didn't find it. He was a miner, and he started his fortune by making lunches for his fellow minors, and that his mother would help him prepare, and lending them money at an exorbitant rate of interest. So, I think it was 25 or 30%, right? And since he had no life, he never did anything, but he then sold life insurance, and then when that became a huge success, went into the funeral business, the banking business.
So he was an entrepreneur.
So when Martin Luther King, he was already a multimillionaire owning many businesses in Birmingham, Alabama, but still not being able to go into the local Chinese restaurant. He would have to go to the back door because he was black. He was not allowed in the front of any white restaurant in Birmingham, Alabama. And he had a motel, and that was where Martin Luther King held his headquarters. So any of the pictures that you see when they were desegregating Birmingham. And my uncle was actually the one who was the go-between, because all of the owners of the department stores knew him and his family. Mm-hmm. And he served as the go-between between the store owners and Martin Luther King Jr. in desegregating the stores. That's what that was all about. Blacks were allowed to buy things, but they couldn't try on anything, and they couldn't use the restrooms, and they couldn't use the elevators, and so there was that kind of restriction. And when Martin Luther King went to jail, and wrote the famous letter, it was my uncle.
The letter from the Birmingham jail?
Right, it was my uncle who bailed him out at the insistence of President Kennedy.
Wow.
And Martin Luther King was saying, no, I think for the benefit of the movement, I need to stay in. And my uncle is saying, no, man, you're out. We need you back out on the street.
I would love to have been a visitor, a guest in your family, in your life. I mean, the events we're talking about here, that you could have been witness to, but I mean, you were probably off at college or too young or whatever.
Right.
Well, the book, anyway, that Carol's talking about, and there's so much more in it, Black Titan, you might want to find it. I want to talk about your work in Africa with the African Medical and Research Foundation, AMREF.
Right.
What is that, and what kind of programs are they doing?
It's the largest African health organization on the continent. I belong to the board of the USA branch of it, and we're in France and England, all over the world in terms of fundraising units. But we operate in about 35 countries in Africa, based in East Africa, but doing everything from HIV, malaria, sanitation, water. You have not lived until you've seen a community that has not had fresh water, have one of these pipes turned on, with the chief coming out and the animals, coming down from the mountain to also take part in this. So we have about a staff of about 1,000 people, health workers, and we've trained, really, it's astronomical, over 500,000 community health workers on the continent, going back to their communities and serving, delivering babies, etc., taking care of the ill. And we estimate that we probably need to do 1.5 million more in order to keep people healthy in Africa.
You said East Africa. What countries are we talking about?
We're based in Kenya, in Nairobi, Tanzania, Uganda. We do some work, we have an office in South Africa and the Sudan. We have a program in the Sudan that trains almost to the level of professional doctor, but in Sudan when you hear the numbers in terms of the number of doctors there are to serve the population, it's really unthinkable. I spent a week in Uganda, in the part right next to the Congo, on a medical mission. We have planes that fly, drop doctors down to work with hospitals and work with clinics. And we spent a week doing fistula repair of women through either violence or childbirth need this operation. And just in terms of the number of operations that were done that week, 100 plus of changing women's lives. And the one thing that I've said about Africans who expect nothing in terms of health care, you will go into a hospital where people are seriously, sometimes terminally, fatally ill, and you will not hear a sound because the tradition is that you're here to help me, and so I'm going to do whatever I can do to, and that includes childbirth, where they don't even give the mothers an aspirin to deliver to deliver babies. So that's AMREF. AMREF Health Africa. I would urge people who have any interest in making an impact, that far away, where a small gift could make so much of a difference in people's lives, to participate.
AMREF.org?
AMREFUSA.org.
Okay. We're quickly running out of time here, and I'm sorry about that. I mean, we need to buy more time on this network and just go on forever. But you have to tell quickly the story of discovering that your father was really your stepfather, and that your real father sort of was royalty.
Right. Well, he was a Tuskegee Airman, a journalist, and a playboy, which my biological father, which is why I didn't get to...
why he wasn't around.
Why he wasn't around. And I didn't know that. In those days, my mother was a little on the angry side. She got married, and I was only 3 when she remarried, so it didn't compute with me that my stepfather was not my real... quote, real father, although he was in the sense of actually having raised me.
Oh, sure.
But then I met him. The only way that I found this out, families are so crazy, was when I was in college, I needed a birth certificate. And then it became very whispers, and then this was divulged to me. And I actually met him because he had been a reporter for the Black Press, and he was now doing a PR.
What was his name?
John Young.
John Young.
Yeah. And so he was, pilot, Tuskegee Airman, good looking. Anyway, I met him when he was on a story, and I was on a story, and I was assigned to that story. And in that crazy way of walking up to him and saying, "Hi, I'm your daughter."
And what did he say?
He was like, "Oh, very casual. I'm so happy to meet you," and then turned and introduced me to the entire gathering there, which then made for complications throughout the rest of my life. Was it, "That's your father," or
what
"That's your father"?
Was this?
That would have been 75. Yeah.
All right. So you were already on television in New York, an established presence. Did he know that? Was he aware of Carol Jenkins, the television?
He knew that. He knew that, but we had not yet met. So it was one of those wonderful, crazy family stories. "Hi, I'm your daughter. Good to meet you."
It's incredible.
Right.
Tell us what you're doing lately. I mean, you got so many projects, but writing a memoir, I guess, is among them.
Right. As you say, I get to tell my side of the story, right? So I'm working
it your way,
my way, working on that, and then I have, I was the founding president of the Women's Media Center.
Of course,
Gloria Steineman, Jane Fonda, and Robin Morgan. Those not so radical feminist women. We started that about 10 years ago. We're celebrating the 10th anniversary this year.
Yeah, dealing with one of your earliest concerns, the power or powerlessness of women in media,
Exactly.
and the absence of women.
Exactly. And so the figures that we publish every year are not all that more encouraging. We now do the filmmakers because that's important, like 2%, 3%, 4%, entrusted with millions it takes now to make films, directors, and then the newscasters, both on television and in print. But I think we could do this. I don't know how long we have to do the studies where they shift, where we approximate the percentage of the population that we are, half. And, one of the other recent studies that we didn't do, but we firmly support, that over this last period of time, 83% of the stories that are told are about men, or men engaged. Still, to this day, that women's stories are considered not that, quote, newsworthy. So there's the Women's Media Center. We talked on the phone this week, and I was busy putting clothes on dolls and doing Play-Doh and trying to corral my
grandmother to three
small children, and
terrific.
Enjoying that.
Yeah, what's not to enjoy? Being a grandparent, and I can't speak to this from personal experience because I don't have grandchildren.
And I offered to share mine with you.
Well, thank you. I'd be happy to take you up on that, because the great thing I hear about grandchildren is when they finally get too much, you can send them off. It's not like being a parent. You can send them back where they belong.
Well, we were talking about the difference in the technology. Do you know that now small children are doing their homework by asking Siri on the I.
No.
Now, so, I mean,
Siri, how much is, 12 multiplied by 6?
Yes, and Siri, I have to do a project on Uganda. Tell me all about it. And my first grader and I were, Avery is now 6 and in the first grade, she wanted to do something on glass blowing. And who knows about glass blowing?
Siri, apparently.
So we looked at, it's just extraordinary, the access of information that's available to all of us now because of the
Listen,
technology.
I know you're writing this memoir. I hope we haven't spoiled sales because you've told certain tales about your life here. But to me, they're teasers, and they're going to pique people's interest in buying the book when it comes out. And you know what? When it comes out, I want to see you back here.
Absolutely.
It's a delight to see you.
Great to see you, Tony. Great.
Thank you. And I am happy you were here and look forward to seeing you next week.